All right, so welcome everyone to another podcast. This time we're going to be talking about the Reformation of the 16th century. I find this such a pivotal moment in European history. You'll see just so many transformations. And so just to start, I want to start by showing this beautiful basilica, the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. If we can point to any one symbol of the Reformation, this might be it. And it's surprising to look at this beautiful example of Renaissance architecture as the pivotal cause for the Reformation. But this building required so much money and funding, and it's a sign of the Pope trying to prove some kind of strength and authority over all. But it also is showing man's domination over the church to a point that it leads to questioning. And the use of the indulgences, the sale of the indulgences, were actually to fund the construction of this basilica. So when Luther is rejecting the sale of indulgences, he's also rejecting this building and this massive building project in Rome. As you can see inside the interior as well, it's an example of Renaissance architecture, and it's gilded in gold. And you can certainly look at this with criticism, I think, of maybe over worldliness and not a greater concern. It's a sharp divide from this to the Gothic cathedrals of medieval times. I like to point to this and sort of start our discussion with the Reformation, looking at this building as really the symbol, the heart of what was going on, and sort of abuses within the church for roots for the Protestant Reformation. So we're going to be going through the Reformation, and we'll sort of be looking at religious causes for the Reformation, and sort of understand that there's also beyond the religious causes, the popularity among the Holy Roman Empire for the Reformation to begin is also because of new economic and political motives that we're seeing at the same time. Particularly once we go beyond even the Holy Roman Empire, and in class when we start talking about Henry VIII and the Church of England, the Reformation takes on a political notion as well as the social notion. But let's first just talk about some of the religious causes for why we have the Reformation. So some basic root causes for the Protestant Reformation. One is religious, and so we have the abuses of the church. These abuses in the church really contributed to an anti-clerical sentiment and a call to reform. People were losing respect for the clergy and started to question their sense of superiority and knowledge of all. So to go through some of the abuses that were occurring within the church, one was simony. Simony is the selling of positions or jobs within the church. So you can buy a position as bishop rather than truly being representative of the faith. Nepotism is another, which is when positions in the church are given to members of one's own family. Absenteeism is when a bishop is never really visiting their diocese, they're not really present, and that really shows more the worldliness concerns of the bishops, and they're more involved in their own lives and using the wealth of others rather than being a real bishop, shepherd of the people. And then pluralism. Many bishops, once they start gaining a lot of wealth and power and clout, start to be in charge of more than one diocese at the same time. Just to review, a diocese is a collection of parishes. So we are currently living within the realm of the New York Archdiocese. So it's New York, the region of New York. And so it's regional and it's headed by a bishop. So if a bishop is in charge of multiple dioceses, there's no way that he's going to really be able to be present and serving the people in the way that it's expected. Along with that, the papacy itself was really losing a lot of prestige. First because of the Babylonian captivity, when Philip the Fair of France sort of captured Pope Boniface, and then we had the Great Schism where we had multiple popes at the same time, if you remember that moment. Popes at that time were looked at as tools of the French monarchy. And then once that got resolved with the conciliar movement, there started to become greater conflict between the bishops meeting in council and the Pope. All of this gets resolved with the Council Council of Constance between 1414 and 1418, where the Pope issue of having, instead of not one, not two, but three popes, when we finally get all that resolved, and we have one final Pope, Martin V, that ushers in this new age then, where we have a Renaissance papacy, as we were describing it, where these popes start to pursue much more secular interests and diplomacy, military campaigns in order to consolidate more temporal power rather than really serving a religious call. So you'll see extending their own power over the papal states, maintaining a lavish court, patronizing the arts, and really living a life of wealth and the symbolism of that. For Martin Luther, our key figure of this whole story, let me just show you a quick picture of him. We'll come back to this image later, but Martin Luther is our guy right over here. For Martin Luther, some of his causes for his frustration, it has its roots in some of the trends that were happening in the Northern Renaissance. So the New Pietism, or Neo-Pietism, or otherwise known as mysticism, that was really stressing a return to more personal piety, simplicity of the Christian church. It also was questioning any need for a really elaborate ritual and customs within the church, or the role of clergy. If I can have a personal, direct connection with God, why do I need to be have a priest serve as some kind of mediator between myself and that relationship? Christian humanism in the Northern Renaissance is really going to be emphasizing the early writings of the Bible and the early church fathers, once again sort of pulling away from the Catholic Church as it stands and calling for reforms. So of course we have the writers of Erasmus from 1509 and more again writing in 1516. They're really going to be inspiring for Martin Luther as well as many of the other thinkers and set a stage for a more receptive environment. Before Martin Luther, so some pre-Lutheran reformers also did set up a legacy of space for calls for reform. This includes John Wycliffe, who was in England from 1330 to 1384. He really emphasized the importance of the Bible, and he led a group known as the Lollards. And then you have Jan Hus, who was in the Czech Republic, and he really directly influenced Luther. Definitely Luther worked off of Hus's work. Hus had read Wycliffe, so they're all linked to one another. Savonarola, who was in Florence, he was the man who was in charge directly before Lorenzo de' Medici returned to Florence and took over, and that's the time when Machiavelli writes The Prince. And Savonarola, in 1400, when he takes over Florence, he does the bonfire of the vanities, where he really is against all the Pope's worldliness, and he destroys a lot of the Renaissance art of the time in Florence, causes a lot of the Florentine artists to actually flee to places of safety, such as Rome. So here you have a religious leader sort of calling for a purging of all these, like the sense of excess. And then, of course, in Erasmus's book, In Praise of Folly, we have the same questioning attitude of the church. Probably the most significant thing for Martin Luther, of course, is going to be the Gutenberg printing press and the Gutenberg Bible. This is what makes Martin Luther's movement stick and spread so rapidly compared to those previous reformers. He's going to have a far-reaching stretch, and he's going to have a much more open environment for his works because of the rise of publishing, and more people are becoming literate, and it's so much cheaper to spread the word and through pamphlets. So the Gutenberg printing press in 1455 really is so important for this age and critical for Martin Luther and the Reformation. It assisted in the spread of these ideas and really helped create a climate of opinion where Luther's criticisms could flourish, right, where they could even exist. With that, again, not only do we have the printing press, but we have the Renaissance spirit, which is going to really promote education, individualism, self-reliance of the middle class. And this middle class, this new emerging class, thanks to the growth of the commercial revolution, this new emerging class is able to emerge in your cities, and the cities start to gain a lot of importance for the kings and for rulers. This middle class starts to really question the status quo. Why is it that nobles and clergy start having so much more privilege than I do? And so they start questioning church authority, the role of the clergy. The secular attitude of this middle class really is contributing to a rejection of medieval values, where the medieval values of things like poverty, asceticism, otherworldliness becomes sort of not valued. If you're a merchant and you're able to afford a nice meal, isn't God there? That's what they would sort of say. Well, isn't God right here in a delicious food? Why can't I enjoy this rather than sacrifice and live for this greater goal of salvation? Um, and for Martin Luther, the most direct cause is going to be the sale of indulgences. So what an indulgence is it's a purchase it's a way to buy your way out of purgatory. So purgatory is this, I'll describe as a room. It's the waiting room before you get called either to the pearly gates of heaven or to the other way. And so purgatory was this period where you were sort of in transition. And um, ideally, of course, you want to get out of that period of purgatory as soon as possible. But it was believed at the time that everyone spent a period of time in purgatory. And so the sale of indulgences, this purchase, would release you from this period of time, or you could purchase it for a loved one, maybe someone who's already deceased, and you have the fear that they might actually be in purgatory. You could save them by purchasing one of these indulgences. These were not cheap things. One thing I want to point out before I go into that, if you notice, this is an image of an indulgence, what I've included here. And if you notice, some parts of it are handwritten, but it's also a print. So even the indulgences, even the other end of the Reformation, the causes for it, are also linked with this printing press. I just think it's so fascinating to really be able to point out. But an indulgence is not a cheap thing. An indulgence also are still available today. You can't buy them. They were originally offered, let's say if you were going on a pilgrimage, or if you were serving the Pope in any kind of way, you could be given an indulgence for that action, for that act of penance, for that work. But at this age, the church was looking for money to help rebuild Rome, to build that basilica. And so they start selling indulgences. These indulgences often cost about a third of your yearly income if you were just a common or ordinary guy. So it's a significant purchase, a third of your income. It was a huge, huge purchase. And there were a series of indulgences that were being offered and really pushed upon the peasants to be buying in the Holy Roman Empire. And that was actually one of the problems with it. One of the weaknesses is both Rome and the local bishops were both calling for the sale of indulgences for their own personal projects. Johann Tetzel, who lived from 1465 to 1519. So Tetzel's an important name to be familiar with. He was a Dominican friar who was appointed by the Archbishop Albert of Mainz in 1517 to sell indulgences on behalf of Rome in Germany. He was sent by Pope Leo X to help raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica, and it was agreed that the proceeds would be split between Albert and the Pope. Now, for Tetzel, he had a personal interest in raising this money because he, like any other tax collector, would be able to pocket some of that money for himself. However, it really was a lose-lose situation. People had already started to sort of almost rebel against the use of the sale of indulgences. It was historically already being questioned. However, Tetzel was a convincing writer and speaker, and he was able to use the printing press and the media to his advantage. And he had sent these pamphlets ahead of time, and was very convincing in selling his indulgences. And so we're going to take some time in class to be able to read over one of his documents. Well, Martin Luther is going to be coming into this world, being exposed and actually encountering Tetzel and those sales. Martin Luther himself, here's his version of Germany. He was born in Saxony, and in Saxony, Germany, to a very wealthy peasant family. He became an Augustinian monk and a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. Now, Wittenberg is a fairly insignificant city, except for the fact that the electors, if you remember that that golden bull that was agreed upon to how we are going to elect the next Holy Roman Emperor, one of those electors, Wittenberg was his capital city. And so it was the the Saxon leader, the Saxon prince. And so as a result of that, Wittenberg does have some importance. Now, in order to build up the prestige of the city that was really a nothing place, to make it any kind of center of anything, the prince is going to establish a university there, in the University of Wittenberg. Once again, not an important place. It's just an early university, but it will become the center of the Reformation thanks to Martin Luther and his work. He really puts the city of Wittenberg on the map and develops it. In 1517, Martin Luther, really fed up with Tetzel's actions, writes the 95 Theses. And in the 95 Theses, he's really protesting against the different calls of the church. Now, within those 95 Theses, Luther sort of outlines what will be some of the main principles of Protestantism. So I want to go over these principles with you now. So one of the principles of Protestantism that have its heart with Martin Luther is sola scriptura, the idea that the authority of the church is in the Bible, not in the magisterium, meaning the persons of the church, the clergy. Your authority is the Bible and the Bible alone. Sola fide is a more complicated idea, I think. It's the idea that you can achieve salvation by faith alone, not through good works. And this connects to that idea of the indulgences. That, remember, the indulgences, you can't just buy your way into heaven. You can't just you can't do something, like you can't go on a pilgrimage in order to achieve heaven. You need to have faith, and faith alone will be able to be there. So justification by faith becomes a common phrase for the Lutherans. And so this justification by faith alone, that you'll achieve salvation by that, really throws away pilgrimages, relics. The use of relics and the sale of relics becomes really unimportant, along with indulgences. The final principle is sola gratia, and this is the belief that there's salvation from gifts of God's grace. So the Catholic Church said instruments of grace were sacraments. So the way that you achieve grace or this connection with God is through sacraments, and those include, there were 7 of them. For Lutheran, they said there were only 2 sacraments, which were baptism and the Eucharist. And so baptism, when you're blessed as a baby or as an adult, accepted into Christian faith, and then the Eucharist meaning the bread that becomes the body of Christ. Now, only those 2 sacraments were reviewed because those were the ones that were emphasized within the Bible in the eyes of Luther. Now, Martin Luther is going to base many of his teachings on Huss, that Czech thinker who was accused of heresy in the Catholic Church. In 1523, Martin Luther is going to be publishing the New Testament translated in the vernacular in German. And Martin Luther is going to really be promoting a series of sort of viewed as quite radical reforms of the clergy and calling for changes. One of the ones that seems most scandalous would be he promoted marriage by the clergy in order to end clerical promiscuity. And after quite a few years himself of not marrying, he ends up marrying a former nun. So it was quite a scandalous marriage once it got squared away. But this marriage really set up a new role for women within the church as well. So the Reformation is going to have effects within economics, as we'll discuss later, but also socially. It changes the dynamic of men and women. The preacher's wife becomes this new ideal role of a woman. Women are then a moral and social model of behavior. There was pressure on her, on Luther's wife, to present herself as this ideal wife, so that she's not just an adulterer or really a whore. I mean, the Catholic Church would really call her that because she was previously technically married to Christ. As a nun, you sort of marry yourself to Christ. And so the fact that she's now sort of had a divorce with Jesus and then remarries Martin Luther is quite the scandal. So she has to live to a certain standard that then presents a model and a real challenge for the future. The emphasis is also then that woman's place is the home and her career is marriage and child. Luther's wife really set up the home economics. His home in Wittenberg was the former Augustinian space. And so he would often host guests at his home, and she would prepare the meals and sort of dote on them and wait on them in a way that sends a message there. Now, Martin Luther, as he's publishing all these pamphlets and he's challenging people to debate, he's really turning the status quo upside down. And the response of the authorities is quite varied. Pope Leo X is the Pope at the time. Now, Leo X is the first of the Medici popes and the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And Pope Leo X issued a papal bull for Luther to either rescind his claims or to be excommunicated. Martin Luther, in response, burned the papal bull. Charles V, in 1519, is the elected Holy Roman Emperor, and he's going to summon Luther to appear before the Diet of Worms in Rhineland. Now, the Diet is the collection of all the different princes coming together. It's the Holy Roman Empire's version of a parliament. And he was called there, once again, to be asked to rescind his calls. Luther was placed at that Diet of Worms under a ban of the empire, but some of the German princes, such as the Saxony Elector, his hometown hero, Frederick the Wise, is one of the ones who holds on to Luther and protects him and his interests against Charles V. The Edict of Worms declares that Luther is a heretic and is banning him from the empire. Martin Luther, when this happens to him, just hides out for a bit in the Wartburg, in this area here. He's going to be hiding there, and then eventually he will be able to return back to Wittenberg. What is one of my favorite phrases, I think really captures Martin Luther and his ideas, is something that he says at this Diet of Worms, which is, "Unless I am convinced by proofs from Scripture or by plain and clear reasons and argument, I cannot and I will not retract, for it is neither safe nor wise to do anything against conscience. Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me, amen." I think this really shows, he is looking and grounding his reasoning from his own self. It's so humanist of him, where the Reformation is really connected with the Renaissance. He wants to use the proof from the Scripture, using the Bible itself. And if I can't see that proof there, then I can refute it. I don't need to support those ideas of the clergy just because they're the clergy. Now, Martin Luther's ideas are going to be spreading fairly quickly. And so here's just a map of the Holy Roman Empire, and you can see that much of the northern region, by the time all the dust settles, of the Holy Roman Empire is going to be converting to Lutheranism. And some of the questions for why really are striving from economic reasons. So for economic reasons, there's a peasant desire for those lands of the church. And so we have a series of peasants' revolts, which we'll discuss a lot more in depth in class, that are really pushing for Lutheranism and challenging Martin Luther himself, actually. But his ideas are promoting this rebellion. It's an opportunity for more land. Imperial knights start to also desire for church land, precipitated on an attack on the church states of the Rhineland. The Lutheran states secularized church properties within their borders, and therefore the Lutheran princes then get to inherit the wealth of that church rather than the wealth of that church going to Rome. So it was in the interest of a Lutheran prince to convert to Lutheranism so that way they can gain even more wealth, attain more wealth and status. There's also this radical notion of utopian communities, a rejection of private property that really appealed to the lower classes. So these utopian worlds, really a lot of them based on the writings of Thomas More, really start to gravitate and be of interest to your lower classes. A future belief, Calvinism, that we'll talk about again, that was also economically interested because it was seen as a justification for material success. That if you were the chosen one, in Calvinism there's the belief of predestination, that if you were one of the chosen ones, then of course you'd be wealthy, that God would be giving you that wealth. So as a middle-class merchant, there's a real attraction to that. So the emerging commercial classes were really appealed to Calvinism. Middle classes in general in England, the German states, and Scandinavian countries really resented the additional taxes that they had to pay to a foreign prince, the Pope. Right? Why do I have to pay this additional tax? I understand the role of my own king protecting me and my trading interests, but this other guy, why am I paying him too? and financial advantages that would result from the stoppage of papal taxation and from confiscation of church lands really had a great appeal to the German princes and the kings of those new territorial states. There's a lot of different reasons why we see the rise of this new period. Politically, peasants are really starting to demand an end of oppressive rule by their overlords, right, both clerical and lay, as part of these Lutheran-inspired peasants' revolts. There's also the development of centralized national states and the growth of a sort of a sense of national consciousness, which really led to that resentment over the papal taxes and appeal of cases to a national court rather than to the canon law of the Pope, of the papacy, and any other kind of foreign interference. The Protestant Reformation really offers kings and princes an opportunity to strengthen their own power by gaining complete control over wealth and influence of national churches. Right? They can really gain a lot of resources there. And German princes saw in the Reformation an opportunity to gain independence from the power of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was aligned by the Pope. He was a symbol of religious orthodoxy. So if they are breaking away, they're reforming, they're becoming Lutheran themselves, they no longer have any obligation to him. Now, what's interesting is that France, Catholic France, the French kings are actually going to be assisting German Protestants as a way of weakening the Holy Roman Emperor and that family, that ruling family, the Habsburgs. And the appeal of Calvinist ideas to different groups in England and in France really are also part of their own resistance against absolute monarchies within those countries. So when we'll be discussing the Huguenots, there's a political motive for them. They're not wanting to be subjects to an absolute rule. They'd like more of a greater democracy. Now, Martin Luther's idea of the priesthood of all believers was used by some Germans as an indication to sort of move towards more equality. And so this is all going to sort of lead to this period of real chaos, first starting with the Peasants' Revolt, and then later on really turning the Holy Roman Empire upside down. So I want to just stop there today. I think I went pretty long enough. So we'll start on Monday talking about the Peasants' Revolt and how all that works out. But I hope you have a great weekend and take care.